Welcome to Cosmic Scene with Jill Jardine. I'm your host, Jill Jardine, master's in counseling psychology, professional astrologer, psychic healer, and yogi. And in today's episode, I combine my skill set as I talk about Carl Jung and astrology, synchronicity, archetypes, and the cosmic psyche. Stay tuned. Welcome, everyone, to the podcast. Today, we're jumping into one of the most fascinating intersections of psychology, mysticism, and ancient wisdom, the relationship between Carl Jung and astrology. And guess what? That's what motivated me to get my master's in psychology, focusing on Jungian psychology. So this is something close to my heart and soul. Now, when most people think of astrology, they think of newspaper horoscopes, zodiac memes, TikTok astrology, or astrology quizzes online. But for Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century, astrology represented something far deeper. Jung believed astrology was connected to the architecture of the human psyche itself. He did not see astrology merely as fortune telling. He saw it as ancient symbolic language, one that reflected patterns of the unconscious mind, archetypes, and meaningful coincidence that seemed to weave through human existence. I agree with him. I never thought astrology was merely fortune telling. I saw in astrology the deep psychological revelations that would help us live our life. And Jung called astrology the intuitive method. He declared on multiple occasions that he verified that certain psychological states or specific events correlated with planetary movement, particularly when Saturn and Uranus were affected. He declared this in 1954 during an interview, and the quote from Carl Jung is that related to psychology is obviously astrology has much to offer psychology, but what the latter can offer its elder sister is less evident. So far as I judge, it would seem to me advantageous for astrology to take the existence of psychology into account, above all, the psychology of the personality and the unconscious. Unquote. Carl Jung. What's extraordinary is that Jung openly spoke about astrology at a time when doing so could threaten his scientific credibility. Been there, done that. Back in the 80s and 90s, we're so lucky now that astrology is mainstream to the point that there's so many TikTok astrologers. But back then, remember, Carl Jung was a Swiss psychoanalyst trained in medicine, a colleague and eventually a rival of Sigmund Freud, working during an era that increasingly worshipped rationalism and material science. Yet, Jung repeatedly returned to astrology, alchemy, dreams, mythology, the I Ching, and mystical symbolism because he believed modern humanity had become spiritually fragmented. Now, remember, this is the early 20th century. We're now almost halfway through the 21st century, and people are just waking up to what Carl Jung has shared with the collective. I woke up to it back many years ago, but I'm so happy to share this with you today. Carl Jung believed the soul speaks in symbols, and astrology for Jung was one of humanity's oldest symbolic systems. So, in this podcast, we're going to explore why Jung was fascinated by astrology, how astrology influenced Jungian psychology, the meaning of archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung's revolutionary idea of synchronicity, why he believed astrology works symbolically rather than causally, and why astrology is still flourishing in modern culture today. This is not merely a conversation about predicting the future. We're going to talk about meaning, about symbols, about destiny, and about the mysterious relationship between the cosmos and the human soul. So stay tuned, put on your seatbelt, and make sure you can take this all in. This is a transmission. This will transform your psyche. Okay, so let's start with Jung's break from conventional psychology. To understand Jung's relationship with astrology, we first need to understand who Carl Jung was. Jung began as a disciple of Sigmund Freud. Freud focused heavily on sexuality, repression, and childhood conditioning as the primary drivers of human behavior. But Carl Jung believed the psyche was much larger than that. He believed that there existed a deeper layer beneath personal memory, a universal psychic field shared by all humanity. He called this the collective unconscious. This collective unconscious contains primordial patterns called archetypes. Here are some examples of archetypes. Are they familiar to you? The mother, the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the trickster, the divine child. They also sound like the major arcana in the tarot deck. Interesting how all these systems come together. Because these archetypes appear across cultures, religions, myths, and dreams throughout human history. And Jung noticed something astonishing. Astrology also described universal personality patterns. The zodiac signs, planetary gods, and mythological symbolism mirrored the archetypes emerging from dreams and mythology. For Jung, astrology was essentially an ancient map of the psyche. He famously stated, quote, "Astrology, like the collective unconscious, with which psychology is concerned, consists of symbolic configurations. The planets are the gods, symbols of the powers of the unconscious," unquote. This is crucial. Jung was not necessarily claiming planets physically cause personality traits through gravitational force or magical vibrations. Rather, he believed astrology symbolically reflected psychic realities. The stars mirrored patterns already existing within consciousness. Let's talk about astrology as an ancient psychology. Jung once called astrology, quote, "the psychology of antiquity and the Middle Ages." Think about that. Before modern psychology existed, ancient civilizations projected psychological meaning onto the heavens. The zodiac became a cosmic language describing human experience. Mars represented aggression and action. Venus symbolized love and attraction. Saturn represented limitation, discipline, karma, and time. The moon symbolized instinct, emotion, and memory. Jung observed that these planetary archetypes behaved psychologically, and he believed humans intuitively recognized these patterns long before modern science emerged. One of his most beautiful statements was, and I share this all the time, is, quote, "We are born at a given moment in a given place. And like vintage years of wine, we have the qualities of the year and season in which we are born," unquote. What an extraordinary image. Like wine absorbing the quality of climate and season, Jung believed human beings emerge carrying the psychological imprint of their moment in time, not necessarily through mechanical causation, but through symbolic resonance. Take a moment, take that in. This is where Jung diverged from both rigid scientists and literalist astrologers. He rejected simplistic explanations about planetary vibrations. He even mocked vague mystical language when astrologers complained everything was energy without deeper understanding. Instead, Jung proposed something far stranger and more sophisticated. Drum roll. He proposed synchronicity. Synchronicity was Jung's most mysterious idea. Synchronicity, and not the song by Sting, but synchronicity became one of Jung's most revolutionary concepts. He defined it as a meaningful coincidence. Events connected not through direct cause and effect, but through meaning. For example, you're thinking intensely about someone you haven't spoken to in years, and suddenly they call. You dream of a symbol and encounter it repeatedly the next day. Hmm. I hear that often in my private astrological consulting. A lot of people, it's the 1111, 111, or 222. Well, numbers are also the language of the universe, as is astrology, or what we would call symbols are the language of the soul, and numbers are symbols. So here's another example of synchronicity. You're contemplating a major life transition, and a powerful astrological transit occurs simultaneously. According to conventional science, these are random coincidences. But Jung believes some coincidences carried psychological significance. Okay, I need to talk about this because as an astrologer of over 35 years, this is why people come. They'll come, they're in some kind of crisis psychologically or out in their life, which is always a mirror of what's happening internally, and they need clarity. I look at their chart and I'm like, oh, Saturn squaring your sun, or you're having your Saturn return, or usually it's Saturn to blame. Sometimes it is Pluto, transformation and psychological, but we can always track what the source of crisis or source of suffering is through astrology. It's not random. In fact, I also give people remedies, which a lot of astrologers don't, to how to weather those times. But Jung believed that coincidences or synchronicity carry psychological significance. He believed invisible patterns connect inner states with outer events. This is where astrology entered his psychological framework. Jung observed that major psychological phases in people's lives often coincided with certain planetary transits, as I was mentioning, particularly involving Saturn and Uranus. Saturn in astrology represents structure, karma, responsibility, and limitation. Uranus represents awakening, disruption, liberation, and radical change. I also noticed that Pluto transits kick the butt, and people tend to come for help during Plutonian because it's deep stuff. Jung noticed that periods of psychological crisis, breakthrough, or transformation often aligned with these symbolic planetary movements. But Jung did not conclude that planets mechanically caused events. Instead, he believed both the psyche and cosmic timing reflected a deeper underlying order, a synchronistic order. He said, quote, the stars are simply used by man to serve as indicators of time, unquote. This is profound. Time itself may possess qualities. Moments are not psychologically identical. Certain periods carry symbolic themes. Astrology then becomes a symbolic clock of consciousness. Hi there, this is Jill Jardine, host of Cosmic Scene with Jill Jardine, and I have some news for you. Some of you know that I have a book that's published called Sacred Sound Formulas to Awaken the Modern Mind, Sanskrit Mantras to Raise Your Vibration. Well, now I have the companion oracle cards for Sacred Sound Formulas to Raise Your Vibration. You're going to have a lot of fun with these. You pull a card, you get the mantra that will help you at whatever moment you pick the card, and so much more. So make sure you go online and order yours now, JillJardine.com. Now let's talk about the zodiac as archetypal energy. Jung believed the zodiac signs reflected archetypal patterns within the collective unconscious. Aries embodies the warrior archetype. Cancer reflects the mother and emotional nurturer. Leo symbolizes sovereignty, creativity, and self-expression. Scorpio represents death, transformation, sexuality, and rebirth. Aquarius carries the archetype of the revolutionary and visionary. Pisces embodies mysticism, transcendence, and dissolution of boundaries. These patterns repeat endlessly across mythology, literature, dreams, religion, and human behavior. Jung saw astrology as an intuitive, symbolic system that encoded these archetypal energies. He believed ancient civilizations unconsciously projected inner psychic patterns onto the heavens. In his words, quote, the starry vault of heaven is in truth the open book of cosmic projection, unquote. Jung understood the symbols are fluid, astrology is not deterministic. The same planetary transit can manifest differently in different individuals. For instance, one Saturn transit may bring discipline and mastery, another one can bring someone into a depression or isolation. One Uranus transit may bring liberation, another could bring chaos and instability. The symbolism remains archetypal, but the expression varies according to the consciousness. I totally agree with that. Could be good, could be bad, depending on where the consciousness is. And that's what we do as astrologers. We mirror it back. And as an astrologer and counselor, therapist, I try to have people take the high road or have their consciousness shift so that they can use the archetypal energy for their benefit. And this is one reason why Jung emphasized individuation. What's individuation? It was key to Jungian therapy. Individuation is becoming who you truly are. And it was at the heart of Jung's psychology, the process of individuation. This means becoming who you truly are, not what society conditioned you to be, not who your family expected you to become, but your authentic soul pattern. Jung believed each person carries an innate blueprint within them, a destiny of becoming. Astrology, in this sense, can function as a symbolic map of psychological potential, not fate carved in stone, but a language describing tendencies, lessons, gifts, and evolutionary themes. The birth chart becomes less about prediction and more about self-understanding. And this is where Jung's ideas profoundly influenced modern psychological astrology. And that's why I got my master's degree, so that I could practice it with my clients, because there wasn't a lot of credentialed systems back in the day. Today, many astrologers interpret charts not as fixed destinies, but as archetypal landscapes of growth, shadow work, trauma, relationships, and soul development. This perspective comes directly from Jungian thought. Now, let's go into a whole nother field of energy with Jung. Let's talk about astrology, quantum physics, and the mystery of reality. One reason Jung remains so relevant today is because modern science itself has become stranger. Quantum physics revealed that reality is far less mechanical than we once believed. Observer effects, non-locality, entanglement, fields of probability. Now, Jung never claimed quantum physics proved astrology, but he sensed reality contained hidden interconnections between conventional causality. And many modern thinkers continue exploring these mysteries today. Could consciousness and the cosmos be interconnected? Could symbolic patterns emerge through deeper organizing principles we don't yet understand? Jung remained open. He resisted simplistic answers. He famously said regarding astrology, quote, "I am not in the least disposed to an either-or explanation. It is both and," unquote. That openness may be one of Jung's greatest gifts. He refused reductionism. He allowed mystery to remain mystery. He also said that constellations mirror the human psyche. Human beings looked into the cosmos and saw themselves, their fears, their gods, their instincts, their spiritual longings, their unconscious drives. And perhaps this is why astrology continues to resonate even in the modern age, because symbols speak directly to the unconscious mind. Or as we say, symbols are the language of the soul. And astrology still fascinates humanity. Jung was amazed that astrology survived the rise of scientific rationalism. And today, perhaps even more than in Jung's era, astrology is everywhere. Social media, TikTok, podcasts. Here, Cosmic Scene with Jill Jardine. Birth chart readings, astrocartography, relationship astrology, lunar rituals. Why? Because modern humanity is spiritually hungry. Jung believed the psyche naturally seeks symbolic meaning. When modern culture becomes overly materialistic, the unconscious compensates by pulling people toward myths, spirituality, and symbolic systems. He wrote that skepticism itself can become an overcompensation against deep unconscious spiritual impulses. In other words, even highly rational people secretly long for mystery. They long for meaning. They long to feel connected to something larger than themselves. Astrology offers symbolic orientation in a chaotic world. It provides narrative structure to human experience. And psychologically, narrative is incredibly important. Humans need stories to understand suffering, transformation, relationships, and destiny. Astrology gives people a mythic framework for their lives. But with all this positivity, Jung had a caution about astrology. He was fascinated by astrology, but he was also cautious about it. He repeatedly warned that astrology becomes dangerous in the hands of literal minded people. He believed astrology should never replace intelligence, self awareness, or psychological depth. He wrote, "It is an apt tool only when used intelligently. It is not at all foolproof." So, this speaks again to the consciousness of the astrologer. It can be very simplistic, and if people aren't educated, which a lot of people aren't, it could be dangerous because they aren't having a background in psychology. They don't know the power of it. And so they misuse it or they make it too simplistic. Astrology has power, and we need to remember that. And we need to go to those astrologers and people who are versed with psychology. And I'm going to end here with a few quotes by Carl Jung. Quote, "Astrology, like the collective unconscious, with which psychology is concerned, consists of symbolic configurations. The planets are the god symbols of the power of the unconscious." Quote, "Astrology is of particular interest to the psychologist since it contains a sort of psychological experience, which we call projected. This means that we find the psychological facts as it were in the constellations. This originally gave rise to the idea that these factors derive from the stars, whereas they are merely in a relation of synchronicity with them. I admit that this is a very curious fact, which throws a peculiar light on the structure of the human mind," unquote. Carl G. Jung in a 1947 letter to Professor B.V. Raman. Here's another quote. "So far as the personality is still potential, it can be called transcendent. And so far as it is unconscious, it is indistinguishable from all those things that carry its projections. That is, symbols of the outside world and the cosmic symbols. These form the psychological basis for the conception of man as a macrocosm through the astrological components of his character," unquote. And one more quote. "Astrologers are influenced by theosophy, so they say." And Carl Jung said, quote, "That is very simple. It is just vibration. But what is vibration? They say it is light energy, perhaps electricity. They are not quite informed. At all events, the vibrations that could influence us have never been seen. So it remains just a word." Carl Jung. And as we close out, one more reflection that Carl Jung stood at the threshold between science and mysticism, between psychology and spirituality, between the rational mind and the symbolic soul. He believed astrology endured because it sparks a timeless psychological language, a language of archetypes, cycles, transformation, meaning, and synchronicity. Whether one views astrology literally, symbolically, spiritually, or psychology, Jung invites us into a deeper question. What if the universe is not meaningless? What if human life unfolds through patterns that are both deeply personal and mysteriously universal? What if symbols are bridges between the inner and outer worlds? And what if the stars are less about controlling fate and more about reflecting the unfolding journey of the consciousness itself? Thank you so much for joining me for this exploration of Carl Jung and astrology. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share it with friends, and leave a review. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Remember to follow me on YouTube at Jill Jardine 2186 and all major podcast platforms. This is Cosmic Scene with Jill Jardine, sending synchronicity and soul symbols into the quantum field.